Marianne Williamson, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's wonderful having you on. Have you had a chance to get some rest over the holiday break?
A little bit, a little bit.
What is it like campaigning for president? It must be exhausting.
It's more psychologically and emotionally exhausting
Mm,
than it is physically exhausting. I mean,
mm,
physically it's grueling, grinding, but the dynamics, it's as though there are two worlds. So the world where you're actually talking to voters is, in my experience, exhilarating. It's why you're doing this. It's talking about things that matter. It's talking about this incredible moment in history, the moment in American society. It's living right at the center of what's possible. So that's beautiful.
mm.
But then there is another, it's almost like a parallel universe. And that's the business of politics. I call it the political media industrial complex. And that is even more disturbing than I found it to be 4 years ago. It's beyond corrupt. It's genuinely undemocratic, and it's manipulative, and it's not what this country should be. So you can't, these days, you can't have the beautiful part that I just mentioned and really participate without also being at the effect of that machine. And if that machine doesn't like you, it's vicious. So that's what I mean by psychologically and
Mm.
emotionally exhausting, and difficult.
So
Difficult.
that's certainly something I want to talk to you about. Before we do, let's rewind a second here and give our audience a sense of who you are. What is your story? You're such an interesting person. You're such a successful person. I mean, some of the stuff is kind of it's remarkable, but it's more commercial in the sense that, four number 1 best-selling books on the New York Times, remarkable. You're a spiritual teacher. You're a humanitarian. You have an organization that you set up in the late 1980s to help, I think, initially people with AIDS. That's produced over 10 million meals. I mean, really remarkable
16
stuff.
million.
16 million. I'm glad you corrected me there. So you've had this remarkable career. On the one hand, you were, I think, as I understand it, you became famous nationally primarily through uh, Oprah, initially being on Oprah's
Yeah.
show, which was such a big deal at the time. So you had this one giant career as a spiritual leader, as a humanitarian, as an author. And in the last 10 years, beginning, I think, with your run for Congress in 2014, you've had this political career. So just give her a sense of our to our audience of sort of who you are. What's the arc of your life exactly?
When I was in college, you read Alan Watts and Ram Dass in the morning, and you went to Vietnam anti-war protests in the afternoon. That was very much the time I grew up in.
So tell our listeners a
Middle
second, just
class.
for people to know, when were you born? What are we
I
talking
was
about here so
born in
people know?
1952, middle class Jewish home in Houston, Texas. Great parents, loving parents, very interesting experiences as a child. My father was a really fascinating person. My parents were world travelers, so we traveled a lot. Um, so there's a way in which nothing, the only thing unique is that there's nothing very unique there. I can meet very few people in this country whose experience feels really unfamiliar to me. Between the way I grew up and what my career has shown me, I feel I'm very well traveled, not only geographically, but sort of socioeconomically.
Hmm.
And that has given me, I think, a lot of insight. So the first thing I mentioned about when I was growing up and the counterculture and the fact that you read Ram Dass and
Alan
Alan
Watts.
Watts in the morning and went to anti-war protests in the afternoon. I grew up at a time of great cultural change,
Hmm.
counterculture, but there wasn't a sense that there were different lanes. It was all of the above. It was musical, it was sexual, it was philosophical, it was political. It was just, if you were part of the change, you were part of the change. There wasn't this sense of you have this lane and you have this lane and you stay in that lane and you stay in that lane, which I think has really fractured the kind of holistic vision of the country and the world that is so necessary at this time. So I began to give lectures about a set of books that I had read. It's called A Course in Miracles, and A Course in Miracles is not a religion. It's a self-study program of spiritual psychotherapy, and it's based on universal spiritual themes. And it's about being a more loving person, about forgiveness, about faith and greater possibility. And as you said, Oprah Winfrey read my first book. And at that time, I don't think people who are growing up now can even imagine what that meant at that time for Oprah to say it's the best book I've ever read. You had
There
a
was no
house called
internet.
that
There was no
after
real internet. I mean, there was technically an internet, but it wasn't
Mhm.
something that was commercially available to most people.
Well, that was in 1992, but you're right. It was the television show that made it all blow up. And out of that, because early in my career, the AIDS crisis burst onto the scene, I had a lot of experience working with people with AIDS, and then that turned into a larger, more extended trajectory of working with people whose lives were in trouble. So I would work up close and personal with people in their darkest hours. But it was at a time in America where people having real serious problems, whether it was a diagnosis of a life-challenging illness, or you find out your child is addicted to heroin, or your spouse just died, whatever it was. That was the sense, not only in individuals that I met, but also in the country. The times of crisis were the exception and not the rule. Now, something began to change over the next 20 years. And we began to be a country where there was not really a thriving middle class, where the economic anxiety that people were experiencing gave rise to so many other problems: debt, medical debt, college loan debt. You're really not even knowing how you were going to feed your children. Because remember, back when there was a thriving middle class, one salary could support a family of four. So I began to see people's lives in trouble, just as I had in the early days of my career. But this time I realized a lot of this crisis is because of bad public policy. And I can help people all I, possibly can through counseling and through a greater spiritual life. But at this point, when you've got a system that's so rigged against them, all the counseling in the world is not going to ultimately fix the larger problem here. And that is when I began to feel, no, you can't leave politics out of this at this point, because our political and economic system is simply no longer fair.
So this is also something I want to talk about, of course, but I still would like to learn a little bit more about you. Uh, so I don't know much about the Course in Miracles. Again, this is the other thing that I find interesting about you is that you're extraordinarily famous, especially I think amongst women. Is that correct? Is your audience more women than men? All the women in my life know who you are. I mean, this is just a fact. Whenever I would bring your name up, they'd be like, "Of course, I know who Marianne Williamson is," and many of them have read your books.
Well, when you're
Um,
talking about serious transformational change in our society, in general, white men are the last ones to get it. Now, I'll tell you why. Because white men are told by a patriarchal status quo that you have power. Women were told you do not have power. Minorities are told you do not have power. The peripheralized in a society, for whatever reason, are told you do not have power. So they're not expecting the traditional status quo to give it to them. And so they're the people who read books
mm,
and investigate and inquire into ideas that sort of move beyond the box. Now we're living at a time where there's such disintegration and decline that everybody,
mm.
it's the zeitgeist of this moment. I don't care what your color, what your sex, even what your socioeconomic status. I think we've reached a moment where people are recognizing that we're moving from one entire paradigm to another paradigm. So things that women, for instance, have been talking about for many years. It was funny even watching the interview that you sent me, that really interesting
Mm,
interview. But they're giving fancy language to things many of us have been talking about for decades, and
mm,
we're told that we were fringe and we were thinkers. Now I'm glad society is catching up.
mm.
However, you know what I'm saying? And this, I think a lot of people within the study of ancient traditions, spiritual and religious traditions, are now hearing things that even scientists are saying. Scientists are verifying things which certain areas of ancient wisdom have been saying probably for millennia.
Mm.
But now science is verifying it, so now we can take it seriously. So I think that it's an interesting shift.
Yeah. So again, the reason I brought that up is because I don't know much about the Course in Miracles, and I wanted to understand it a little bit better, and I know that our audience does. Before I ask that question, I just want to validate, it does feel like we're living during a time where many of our bedrock assumptions, not just about society and politics, but about our underlying reality and the nature of reality, are coming into question. Whether it is this fascination with unidentified anomalous phenomena, whether it is artificial intelligence, the nature of free will, whether it is the nature of our own reality, who we are, whether we have a soul, religious questions. People feel, I think, I'm not sure, and I'm so I guess I'm curious. This is a question. One, do you agree with that? And what do you think is driving that? That sort of um, reassessment of sort of bedrock foundations about the world and ourselves.
Well, first of all, I 100% agree. And if you look at the mindset of the 20th century, it was different than the mindset of the 19th. The mindset of the 21st century is simply different than the 20th. And remember, this was not just a shift century to century, but millennia to millennia, right?
Mm.
So the 20th century mindset was mechanistic. It was based on a Newtonian paradigm. The idea that the world is just a big machine, and if you don't like what's happening in the world, you just fix the pieces of the machine. And the machine were, by definition, external phenomena. And when that paradigm and when that philosophical worldview took hold, and particularly with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there was such fascination with that which is external. It's almost as though an internal musculature began to wither. And there was a lot of resistance to that. This is where you had people like Walt Whitman and Emerson and artists and philosophers, the transcendentalists, both here and in England, sort of trying to warn us, don't do this, because the balance of nature in terms of what it means to be human is both the outer life and the inner life, and that there are objective discernible laws of internal phenomena, just as there are objective discernible laws of the external. Now we're living at a time where people recognize that the dominant mindset of the 20th century not only did not solve everybody's problems, and that's not to say the scientific Western materialism hasn't had any good to it, because it has. However, people are recognizing that it not only didn't solve all the problems, but in many ways created more of them. And that this rebalancing is absolutely essential. So when you say that people are asking the deeper questions, they're asking the deeper questions that are actually ancient questions. And there's nothing new going on here. We're asking the questions that were peripheralized and marginalized that people have been asking since Plato and Aristotle. And she says, and Buddha and the Old Testament. These are, you know what I'm saying? So I love how these people think they're coming up with something new. No, they're coming up with some emergent conversations, which now people see are not irrelevant the way they were deemed to be 50 years ago, but which in fact are deeply relevant to the fate of humanity.
I'm actually currently reading a book by Megan O'Giblin. I don't want to mess up her name. She's coming on the podcast. The book is called God, Human, Animal, Machine, and it deals with exactly these sort of subjects. She was someone who grew up in a religious family, and then became disillusioned, and became an atheist, then got involved in some of these transhumanist circles. And I feel like there's what I seem to and this is sort of the question that this is also going to is, because you speak with so many people and you seem to be even more popular with young people than you are with older people. And I'm curious if you see this, if you see younger people who are trying to find a language to describe that, to sort of be in touch with the mystery that we all are sort of, whether we're aware of it or not, we're grappling with in our lives, trying to sort of find the words to describe it. I mean, do you find that this is something that people, younger people especially, are grappling with today?
Well, they're not 20th century people. So the 20th century paradigm that I described isn't natural to them. The 21st century paradigm is far more holistic and whole person. That's far more natural to them. Gen Z either wasn't born in the 20th century or just kind of hung out there for a few years when they were literally small children.
Mm.
So, and not only that, but they see its effects because it spawned terrible ideas. It spawned, among other things, great injustices economically and otherwise, because it has this, it ended up with this obeisance to this almost fundamentalist, unfettered capitalism that puts short-term financial gain above and beyond all else. So Gen Z is the first generation that can experience from the gate, there is nothing there for me. None of that promise accrues to me. And they don't understand why they should have to live at the effect of bad economic ideas. Now, you ask me, are they grappling with language? No, I think that they're finding their language. I think that they would look at us and wonder if we're grappling with it. They're very clear. And the main thing they're saying that's so clear is that this is painful and this is not working for me. And I will never be able to own a house. And I don't even know if it will be a moral decision for me to have children. And you people are nuts who not only created the system, but maintain this system. So I don't see where they're grappling with the language.
I guess I didn't do a great
they're
job
grappling with the yeah. Now I see what you're saying, but I hope you understand that the difference. They are grappling with the reality that they have inherited. That's what I think they're grappling with, the reality they have inherited from an obsolete worldview that has produced a disintegration. We're living at a time when there are two parallel universes. And one is a civilization that's disintegrating. It's simply falling apart. Things are just, it's almost like American civilization is like built of chalk and we're watching it just crumble. Something so, I think, almost terrifying in our midst. And at the same time, we can all sense this new world that is struggling to be born. Both are true. The peril is very real, but the possibilities are extraordinary and magnificent.
So again, back to you now. You seem like someone. So I'm gonna try my best to articulate this. We live in a very commercialized world where lots of people, especially people in the new age community or people in the self-help community, are sort of overly commercialized, very branded. You don't come across that way. You come across extremely authentic, and you come across as someone who really has a message to deliver. I'm curious, before we sort of get into what that message is, which I'm curious to understand it, and what sort of the purpose of your life is and your purpose in politics is. Was there a moment in your life where, looking back, you can say that was the moment that set you on the path of becoming who you are today? And if so, what was that for you?
I think the moment we were all set on the path to become who we are is the moment we were born. I don't have this kind of eureka philosophy of human development and transformation. I think we all mature or not. We grow. We learn.
Did you always feel like you knew your purpose, though? Because it seems like, reading a bit about your biography, that there was a point in your 20s where you developed some sense of direction. And I ask that specifically because I think about a lot of young people today who are struggling to find that.
I look back, I was born to really good parents, really good people. We're Jews, tikkun olam, that you're here to serve something bigger than yourself. My father was an immigration attorney. I didn't even realize it at the time, but looking at where the world is today, I realized how fortunate I was to grow up in a home where things like character and ethics and being a good person mattered, but no more than most people. My father, because he did have my father had been raised in poverty and never let us forget that life was very hard for many, many people, and did make us feel that the purpose of our lives, whether he would have put it that way or not, I don't think, but that the purpose of our lives was to seek to be contributors. But I don't think that that's any more true of me than of most people I know. It's just I got very lucky because Oprah Winfrey liked my book, you know?
Well, I also heard a story that your father took you to Vietnam in 1965 because you came home from school and told him that your teacher was supported the war and he wanted to show you why it was wrong. Tell me, do I have that
Yeah,
story right? And what that's a pretty
yeah,
extraordinary story.
yeah. I was, yeah, I was in the 7th grade and I came home from school and my social studies teacher had explained the domino theory.
Oh,
And
wow,
the
we got that
domino
in
theory
seventh
was
grade,
this
huh?
idea. Right, that's right. The domino theory was that if we let Vietnam fall, then all these other Southeast Asian countries would fall and the communists would take over. And that if we didn't uh, stand them down in Vietnam, that we would one day be fighting the communists on the shores of Hawaii. Now, I was just informing my parents. So we're at dinner and I start explaining to my parents about, now I noticed my mother is going like like she would almost know what was coming on. Oh, uh-oh. And then my father's face is just turning, it's blanching, right? And all of a sudden he stands up. That's it. Sweetheart, he called my mother. Get the visas. He said, we're going to Vietnam. The military industrial complex is not going to eat my children's brains. And then my mother, in that inimitable way that she had, and the way they interacted, she was like, oh Sam, but she did it. And we went.
Wow. Can you tell me a little bit about what that trip was like?
Well, at that time, you could be in Saigon. You couldn't be the battle zone was 5 miles out. But certainly if you have a battle zone 5 miles out, you feel the tension in the city. And my father explained things to us. He would show us a wall and say, you know what's on those walls, kids? Those are bullet holes. And he explained to us about the American war machine. He told us that we were not doing the right thing in Vietnam. Um, my father was a lefty. He was like a cross between William Kunstler and Zorba the Greek. He was a magical character.
He certainly sounds like it. That's just absolutely remarkable. It's not a sort of rubric I have in my head of, Vietnam is Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese, American soldiers. You don't think about American families going to visit Vietnam in 1965, and
No.
such an early
Well,
time as well. He
most
was
the
really ahead of
families
his time.
didn't have my father as
Yeah.
the head of the household.
So you
I
talk a
was
lot.
also behind the Iron Curtain, and we were, I was traveled behind the Iron Curtain at that time, what it was called, the
Really? So
Iron
you went to
Curtain.
Western Berlin?
Mhm. No, I didn't, but I did go to Russia, was in Finland, was in Hungary. Um,
Oh,
and
behind the Iron
people
Curtain.
used to,
Behind the Iron Curtain.
yeah, behind. So not Western, it would have been East Berlin, although we
Or
didn't go there.
I thought I heard
No.
in my head I thought Berlin Wall. I don't know what.
No, right. Well, it would have been the Berlin Wall, but if it had been behind the Iron Curtain, it would have
Yeah,
been,
you've been
of
in
course,
East
East.
Germany.
Yeah, of course.
I didn't even, that just shows you how weird that sounds to me, that I didn't even have it in my head that you'd be traveling, to behind
To
the Iron
Moscow.
Curtain. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't even think of
Well,
that.
so people used to say two things about that. People used to say to my father, why are you taking the children to travel in these places at such a young age? They won't remember it. He used to tell this story all the time. And he would say it will get under their skin. And he was absolutely right. And I'll take Russia as an example. The Russians love little kids. I don't know if they're still that way now, but they certainly were at that time. And so when I was like 10 and 12 years old, I went to Russia and experienced this society in which everybody was making such a big deal about me because I was a little kid. And so then when I started hearing propaganda about any group of people,
Mm.
it was already in my visceral makeup that no, everybody's the same everywhere. And it really affected me about Russians at that time because no, they were really nice, right, in terms of being a small child. So there was a lot of American propaganda that I would hear later that I don't think that I was vulnerable to because of my experiences having traveled so much as a child.
So
I really got at a deep level, people are the same everywhere. People are people. When you know that at the kind of level that my father introduced to us, you see the world in a different way.
So you speak a lot about love. You famously had that line in the Democratic primary in 2020, where you called out Donald Trump and you said,
I'll meet you.
love will cast that out, and I'll meet you on the field, and love will win." Tell me, tell me about how love comes up for you in the process of campaigning for president. What is the relevancy of that, and what does it mean to you? What is the significance of it, and why do you bring it up as often as you do?
Well, I think I probably don't even bring it up enough now because I'm so nervous having been so uh, derided. You know,
Mm,
when I mentioned that one line, it was a moment of nervousness as much as anything
mm,
else, and I think I sounded silly, and uh, that hurt actually because it did contribute to this mischaracterization of who I
mm,
am, this kooky lady, crystal lady
mm,
stuff. I believe that love is what we're here for. I think love is what we are. I think God is love. And I think that that applies to our collective behavior and our collective experience as much as it applies to our individual behavior and our individual experience. And I believe that the same things that make life work for you as an individual make life work for us collectively. They work for you individually if you try to be a good person. You try to have um, ethics and honor and character and integrity and care about other people and care about the earth and care about human connection and care about life around you. Any of us know that when we at least make a good, sincere effort to live in the space of those things as individuals, life works better. And when we
mm.
don't, all manner of chaos is brought forth. Well, I think that's as true of us collectively as individually. And all that a country is a collection of individuals. So if all you're going to say is that people are good, but it doesn't matter how the country behaves, then ultimately people are going to be at the effect of public policies which have control over our lives and an effect on our lives whether we wish them to or not. You know,
I,
I think that everything in that sense is a moral issue. I think economics should express the better angels of our nature. Our foreign policy should reflect the better angels of our nature. Our public issues should demand as much moral consideration as our personal issues. And you know, that's like that interview that you sent me. That's really all that interview is about. What happens when you have such significant aspects of our collective
mm.
experience dominated by basically by an amoral economic consideration? And that which is amoral ultimately has immoral consequences. And we're seeing that in our world today. And if we don't stop this, if we don't fundamentally turn this around, we will destroy ourselves. And that's why I don't think that you can leave politics out of the larger conversation that we have to be having. So I have had a career for 40 years working on how these things apply in very practical ways to our personal experience. But ultimately, when AI is a perfect example, economics is a perfect example, foreign policy is a perfect example. Ultimately, we've got to do more than just take care of how we individually behave. We have to consider these larger issues in terms of how they affect a society at large.
So the interview you're citing was an interview that Joe Rogan did of Ozza Ruskin and Tristan Harris, both founders of the Humane Center for Humane Tech. And I thought I've sent it to a bunch of people because I thought that they did a very good job in that interview articulating the severity of the problem. And that severity of the problem wasn't just social media, which is something that they both talked about separately, but especially Tristan, but putting really social media within the context of the larger revolution that's happening with artificial intelligence and the intermediating technologies that we use to interface with this with AI. And Tristan, I think at some point said that social media was sort of round one, man versus AI, and AI won. And I've often made the case on this show, including most recently with the former head of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, that this is a really serious problem that requires government regulation. And I actually, I thought about this. Actually, I spoke with someone else more recently. It hasn't come out yet, but it will before your episode airs, with Gary Gessler. And he wrote a book. His most recent book is The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. And we talked about the period of the New Deal and the progressive and populist era where this these sort of archetypes of labor versus capital developed. And then later on, the 1970s and 80s, especially with Ralph Nader and his Raiders, we got concerned for the consumer, and we had this sense of like consumer rights and protecting the consumer from uncompetitive business. And I feel like while those two things have relative importance today, they have their place. There's something that there's something new that's happening here that we haven't quite articulated yet. We haven't found the language to describe. And I don't have it here. I sometimes I think of it as interiority or human agency or consciousness.
A lot of us call it spirituality, darling.
Yeah, or what I'm trying to capture is the sanctity of the human being in
But that's
society.
what that's so interesting because that's what I'm saying. That is what spirituality is.
Hmm.
Spirituality is the path of the heart. So I cannot imagine a more relevant conversation than real fundamental spirituality right now, the great spiritual themes at the heart of all the great religious teachings of the world. The emotional, psychological, and moral chaos that dominates the world in all the ways that you're referring to right now. The first conversation it wants to get rid of is the spiritual. But it's interesting to me that you're talking about it in terms of we're grappling to find it. It's there. You know, it's like when I was listening to that interview, I thought, well, when they are programming all this data into these systems, they should be programming St. Augustine. They should be programming Thomas Aquinas. They should be programming Aristotle. They should be programming Martin Buber. It's not, once again, it's more, and that it's almost occult in nature, only in the sense of hidden. But I don't think it's, you say interiority, but once again, that's what the spirit is. The spirit is the internal domain.
So, not to disagree with you sort of at the higher level, but I mean it more specifically when it comes to public policy. So in the last 20 years, we've lost a big part of that interiority is privacy, right? The sanctity of my experience, my right to my own thoughts and feelings, not to feel that I need to constantly be evading the sort of big brother surveillance state or the surveillance capitalism as Shoshana Zuboff has so brilliantly written. And I feel like the next stage there is the loss of control over our thoughts and our agency, because these technologies are so good at manipulating our thoughts and manipulating our behavior. And we see it most profoundly in children. How we've allowed it to get this bad so fast
I
is
agree.
beyond my understanding. And so I think I don't really see anyone that has put forward. For example, we had Andrew Yang on the show, who, by the way, thinks very highly of you and was very critical of the people that in general, the way the media treated you. And by the way, I didn't think that you sounded silly. I think you actually, in that line, I understand what you mean. The line about love, it's hard to land that properly, but I think you're a courageous person to speak about the things that you speak about. It's not easy to go out there. You could be like everybody else, but you're not. You're trying to be true to who you are. So I appreciate that. But my point is that I think that the challenge is how do we put forward a policy agenda that properly addresses and conveys to people the severity of the problem here in the way that the public understood eventually the severity of the problem of industrialization and how our conception of government and what freedom meant in 1776 versus what it meant in 1900 with private concentrations of wealth and power that had the ability to corrupt government in a way that wasn't possible 100 years ago, and where individual labor, didn't confer to you the same level of power as an individual. An individual in 1800 could sell his or her labor in a way, was free to sell his or her labor and use it to earn a living in a way that he wasn't or she wasn't in 1900 and certainly isn't today. And similarly, when we founded this country, there weren't these types of technologies didn't exist. The amount of power that these people have at their disposal, forget, solving the alignment problem and whether or not we can actually survive in a world where AI is so intelligent that it's managing and running everything. But just in a world where there are individuals who control these technologies and these technologies are able to influence our thoughts and our behaviors, that to me is a public crisis of the
I
highest
agree.
order. So talk to me about how much you've thought of this and what Marianne Williamson administration would do to try and address it.
I've thought about it a lot. It's one of the reasons I'm running. I've thought about it a lot. I think it is more than it's almost like if you wanted to say hyper crisis, because what you're talking about here, AI being a perfect example, could lead to the destruction of the world. It is hacking our moral center. It is hacking in a sense of ethics. It is hacking, and it is hacking that which is most important, which is human reflection on the good and the true and the beautiful and the purpose of life. And these things, once again, I think that interview really spoke a lot to it, how this thing just was taken out of the box so fast with a lack of that kind of ethical consideration on the part of these tech geniuses and these tech giants and these tech masters who are holding, it's like early in the interview, it says, I felt like we were talking to Robert Oppenheimer here. And these AI geniuses were saying, this is really bad. This is really bad, because they know it. And all because of this false god that we have made of capitalism. All because we bow down to an economic system. Nothing in the material world is holy or unholy, except as determined by the purpose the mind gives to it. So if you want to say this is to be used for good, whether it's social media or AI, there are all kinds of ways it could be used for good. But these things can also, as we well know, be used for purposes of bad. But if the people who are putting it out there are making the bottom line, how this is going to increase my stockholder value, not how this is going to create good for the world, not how it's going to create public cohesion, then we
don't have a language for that. You see, we don't have a language for that.
See, in my world, we very much have a language for that.
Well, I mean, in public policy circles and in public conversations, there's the dominant language is profit. The dominant language is power. It isn't.
Okay, but it's really interesting what's happening right here. You're invisibilizing me even as we speak. Yes, you do. You have someone running for president who is actually talking about those things. And that's exactly why the system would say, oh, don't look at her. Don't listen to her. Like, she's invisible. She's not really there. But that's exactly the conversation. But this is what's important, I think significant in my experience. The American people are ready for it. When you talk about public policy circles, there is this elite public policy wonk thing centered in Washington, D.C. and in New York to some extent, Los Angeles. They don't talk about the deeper ethical issues because they think they're too smart. They have this smug, elitist, arrogant attitude. It's the same attitude that Bibi Netanyahu had when he said, oh, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about that. We're smart. We know what we're doing. No, you didn't know what you're doing. And the same thing with the elite in Washington. They're doing the same thing they did in 2016. They have no sense of what's really going on. And so I don't find the American people unwilling, by the way, on both right and left. I find that people, in my experience, which is why that's the exhilarating part of running, do want to talk about these public policy issues within a larger moral context and the context of interiority or spirituality or something. I don't find the American people are not ready to go there. It's those who own the system and keep a lid. By keeping a lid on the will of the people, they're keeping a lid on the possible conversations.
But why is there such an appeal for darkness? Why do these dark messages seem to resonate in America today?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because both parts live within us. But, it's like the old story about which do you feed? Which do you feed? Now, when I grew up, I grew up in an America, not where there weren't homophobes, there weren't anti-Semites, there weren't racists, there weren't bigots. Everybody knew they were there. But we had some social guardrails, and there was a sense of healthy shame. And there was a sense that it was understood that no major political party would give a megaphone to such people. You had television shows that tended to end with some kind of moral lesson. What happened, once again, in large part because of social media, also because of a malignant narcissist with political power who figured out that by stoking those lower brainstem energies, he could actually build more political power. You put those two things together and the guardrails have broken down. So now we have the task before us. And I think podcasts give us the opportunity, books give us the opportunity to have a higher level conversation. Now, what I found in my career, this is the deal. I could say to you, oh, people want to have these more meaningful conversations. You can have these more meaningful conversations. As a matter of fact, you could have a more meaningful conversation. There's such a hunger for a more meaningful conversation. You could have a bestseller. And the system doesn't even mind if you have a bestseller, because that feeds a capitalist structure. That the system doesn't mind that. But if you try to actually start affecting public policy, if you actually come into where you could actually make a difference in how public policy works, oh, they're coming after you.
So the thing though is that I think we both agree on this, that we've reached, and I think many people feel this way as well. We've reached a point of unsustainability in the way that the structure operates, and this
Correct.
doesn't benefit anyone long
That's
term.
right.
And
Nope.
increasingly, it benefits fewer and fewer people, including people with money, because even if you have lots of money, at least someone like me, for example, there no amount of money can change the suffering in the world, can make me feel better about the discourse in America. I was speaking to a friend of mine about this recently. I was telling him that I got a cold recently. I'm still kind of fighting it off, and I had some stomach issues around it. And he goes, it's so interesting you say that. I was speaking with my wife about this also, and he goes, while I'm open, obviously, to the fact that there might be a bug going on, I also tend to think about how there's so much going on in the world today that's difficult to digest. And I think so many people do live with a sense of unease about the times today, whether it's the open-ended wars and the uncertainty around our relationship with China and where that's going to go, whether it's AI and where that points to, whether it is the disillusionment with institutions, whether it is the 2024 election and the tenor of the conversations. There's a sense in which the country's coming apart, and it's almost like no one's at the wheel. Does
I
that
agree with you.
Yeah.
Listen, that's why I'm running for president. That's
And
why
that's
I'm
what
running for president.
we're
Because
talking. Yeah.
we need somebody at the wheel who sees things that way.
So to go back to this point about policies. So you're obviously, look, you don't need to be an expert, Ronald Reagan wasn't an expert, and he was one of the most effective presidents in US history. What you need is to surround yourself with smart and capable people that understand the system in order to effectuate change based on your vision. How have you gone about thinking about who you would appoint? Walk me through, because I've obviously never run for president. Not only have I not run for president, I haven't even thought about what that would be like. That to me, that would sound like such a nightmare to have to go through. How would you go about trying to solve some of these problems? So we talked about this issue of AI, social media regulation. Um, what would you do in this case, or what are the other areas that you've thought about, and what would you do policy wise? Give us some specifics here.
We have, in the way America runs, once again, because our political system is still ensconced and embedded in 20th century thinking. Einstein said we will not solve the problems of the world from the level of thinking we created them. And what came from that is this myth of the experts, the technocrats, right? But the problem is not that we need more technocrats. We need people with a vision. We have plenty of political car mechanics. The problem is we're on the wrong road. The last people we should be trusting to get us out of this ditch are the people whose entire careers have been spent driving the car that drove us into this ditch. So you can have smart people. I mean, Hitler was surrounded by smart people. That's the problem here. It's this morally neutral, this idea if you're intelligent enough, you can get the job done.
Well, you have to navigate the system. That's no easy task.
But let me finish. Well, it is no easy task, but there is a new kind of leadership emerging in America today. People who are very smart, who understand how to navigate the system, who understand, and it's the kind of people that you have on your show, right? The kind of people that were being interviewed in the interview that you sent me. They understand, but they're coming from a place of, I don't want to just use this in order to increase stockholder value.
Yeah,
for
there's a sense of the public interest, which seems to be lacking so much today.
So when you say, who do I want the people who definitely understand the system, who definitely understand how to navigate the system, but understand that that's not the end, that's the means. that understanding how to navigate the system is just the means to turning the whole thing around. To the way I see it, we're on a ship headed for the iceberg, and we need to turn this thing around. And the way I see the Republicans is they're heading it right for the iceberg. And I see the corporatist Democrats who are still putting corporate profits, using corporate, profit maximization as our governing principle, are just moving them more slowly and would hit it at a different angle. We want to turn this thing around. And of course, you have to have people who know how to drive the ship, but who understand that the whole point of driving the ship is so that we could turn it around in time.
So, as someone who preaches and talks about love as much as you do, how would you lead such a militarized country at such a precarious time where we have one major war that we're funding against an adversary, a proxy war in Ukraine? We have the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been going on forever, and now it's in a period of increased animosity and atrocities and bombing in Gaza after the October 7th attacks against the Israelis. We have a potential expansion of that conflict in the Middle East with Iran. And we have, of course, the really dangerous unresolved issue of Taiwan and a possible war over Taiwan as China seeks to expand its influence internationally. How would you go about managing those realities, the national security questions of this country?
First of all, you need a president who is very clear with the American people that Washington is in many ways run by warmongers. That's the first thing you have to understand. It's called the blob. It's a forever war machine. Our foreign policy, particularly our military policies, I think anybody with open eyes can see, have not been run with a bottom line of righteousness in foreign policy decision-making so much as in short-term profits for Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, and so forth. This is very clear about Iraq, very clear about the last 20 years in Afghanistan, and there are a lot of questions about what's going on today. So that's the first thing you need to do. Now, we need a strong military. I look at the military like I look at a surgeon. If you need surgery, you better have the best surgeon. The United States needs to have the best surgeon, and we need to have the best surgeon on hand. However, a reasonable person tries to avoid surgery. You only go into surgery
How do we do that,
if
though?
necessary. Okay, so you look at every situation. So let's take Ukraine. America did not have clean hands there with NATO, with the Aegis missiles in Poland, with apparently some early opportunities for negotiation that the United States eschewed, et cetera. However, none of that, to me, justified the atrocious behavior of Vladimir Putin, the idea that someone like him could simply invade another foreign country and say, this is going to be ours now. And so for that reason, knowing that we cannot just be an isolationist country, that this stuff does matter if bad guys think that they can do that whenever they want, and that the West particularly must stand up to that. For that reason, at the beginning, I agreed with President Biden's policy, basically. But I, like many others, were hoping that their counteroffensive over the last few months would be more successful. It's been obvious for a very long time that this was going to have to end in a negotiated settlement, but I had hopes for that counteroffensive. At this point, the fact that we're kind of at a stalemate and a war of attrition, I would be open to having a conversation with Vladimir Putin in a way that I would not have been open 6 months ago. In terms of Israel, I'm sorry, go on. Did you?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please go ahead. And I have a larger question about military readiness.
Okay. In terms of Israel and Gaza, I do not believe that the bombardment of Gaza is even strategically, much less morally correct. As atrocious, as barbaric, as absolutely evil as the attacks on October 7th were, there's no way you can justify them, no way you can minimize them from a moral position. At the same time, most of us understand they did not occur in a vacuum. And so I do support a ceasefire, return of the hostages, and I believe that the American position should be immediate architecture for a two-state solution, an international consortium, primarily led by Arab powers, although the United States should certainly be an active and passionate participant. But our commitment should be to equal peace, sovereignty, and security for both peoples. And to me, a two-state solution is the only way to do that. In terms of Taiwan, in terms of the South China Sea, in terms of our relationship with China, it concerns me that so many people in Washington are like chomping at the bit. They look at Ukraine and Gaza as appetizers. The evil entree they're interested in is war with China. We must not go to war with China. We're talking casually about things that could lead to nuclear holocaust. And so everything, I believe that the American president should be involved in preventing the day when we ever even have to think about how to respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The president has said that we would commit forces. We would not, in a Williamson administration, we would not go to war with China.
How do we create the conditions for peace? How much of that is about being prepared for war and investing in military readiness? One of the things that we've talked about on this program before that's become apparent since the onset of the Ukraine war is depleted military stockpiles. And in some cases, I've cited a study that came out of the Center for Strategic and International Studies called Empty Bins in a Wartime Environment, where some of the projections showed that in the case of some long-range missiles that would be needed to defend the Taiwanese in the event of a Chinese invasion, the U.S. military would run out of those in a matter of a week. Do you believe? How would you? This is the challenge, right? I mean, this is the same thing with Ukraine. All these reports have come out about corruption in the money that's been given to Ukraine for self-defense. How do you manage the fact that there is so much corruption? There are so many people that have financial interests in war. The military industrial congressional complex is a real thing. How do you manage that with the fact that the United States needs to be able to credibly deter an adversary if we actually want to prevent a war? And one of the problems that's occurred is that American deterrence is failing. It failed in Ukraine. It failed in the case of Israel Gaza. Well, not the specific case of Hamas attacking Israel, but the fact that the situation continues to sort of spiral on the edge of chaos in the Middle East is because America is no longer seen as a credible, being able to exercise credible deterrence. But it's not clear to me that the country's in a place where we really have the public support to maintain anything like the rules-based international order that we have. It's been our job to maintain the last several decades. So I guess overall, strategically, what is America's role in the world today, just given the realities of where we are, in your view?
You just said something about how we're on the edge of chaos in Gaza because American deterrence did not work. No, we're on the edge of chaos in large part because America was not more honest with Israel.
Yeah, no, I don't mean that. I don't mean specifically with respect to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I do mean with the role of Iran and the fact. Yeah, go ahead.
I understand that. I'm trying to make a larger point. The point is that the idea that brute force is the primary model for maintaining and keeping peace needs to go away. It's a 20th century thinking. And that's why I want a Department of Peace. We need to wage peace. We need to imagine a world at peace. And in 100 years from now, we need to imagine a world without war 100 years from now and reverse engineer from there. JFK said, if mankind does not get rid of war, war will get rid of mankind. Just like we play war games, we need to play peace games. You can't just fight sickness, you have to cultivate health. You can't just fight wars, you have to cultivate peace. And peace must be predicated on issues of justice and brotherhood, which actually statistically increase the incidence of peace and lower the incidence of violence, which are educational opportunities for children, greater economic opportunities for women, reduction of violence against women, and a reduction of unnecessary human despair. If so much of the money, when you look at the $858 billion that we spend on the military. And by the way, a lot of this preparedness that people are talking about is preparedness to fight a 20th century war. It's not even preparedness necessarily to fight what a war would actually be in the 21st century, because that would have a lot more to do with cybersecurity, would have a lot more to do with all the kinds of things like such as AI and so forth that other countries seem more aware of. So we have to actually concern ourselves with increasing the chances that there would not be war, which would, and that's why I mentioned, for instance, a greater honesty with our allies in Israel, a greater honesty verbally, passionately, that the occupation of West Bank was illegal, that the settlements were illegal, that the blockade in Gaza was wrong. We have to address, Franklin Roosevelt said we need to do more than end wars. We need to end the beginnings of all wars. And the United States foreign policy for decades now has mightily contributed to conditions that made war more likely. Now, you use military when you absolutely must use military, but we've used it like just this sort of, well, brute force will fix it, brute force will fix it. And it's becoming obvious that just this constant application of brute force not only does not fix it, but is only making the world a more dangerous place.
No, we have been very wise the last few decades. And
I think that you use that word is very relevant. There's no wisdom in those rooms. And those rooms are far too dominated by corporate lobbyists from the defense contractors, from the military industrial complex. The bottom line of contributing to this is why the Pentagon keeps failing audit after audit. And that's one of the first things I would do as president, is to audit the Pentagon every cent. And I'm sure that it would fail that one.
No, look, I mean, listeners know that in the lead up to the Ukraine war, in the years before that, I was very critical on this show and brought on guests to talk about the way in which the media and the institutions in the United States were drumming up fears about Russia and unnecessarily demonizing the country. It was also, besides the fact that it was hysteria, it was also strategically stupid. But when Putin invaded Ukraine, I, like you, supported the resistance. I've become increasingly pessimistic about our competency here when it comes to being able to, and it's not just an issue of leadership, it's also about where we are as a country and whether or not the public, one, the messaging has to be right. The story has to be correct that people can understand about what is our role in the world, and also sharing the burden. This is something else that's a huge issue. Sharing the costs and sharing the benefits of creating a security paradigm that actually keeps the world in a safer place than it would be if things continue to spiral out of control. I've become increasingly pessimistic about our ability to do that, which is why I like you, I'm very concerned about a possible war over Taiwan, because I question whether we're actually prepared to manage that. And the worst case scenario would be if we fumbled into a war that we weren't actually prepared to fight. And because in part we don't have the supply chains to manage a prolonged war, and that would be devastating. So
Well,
yeah.
What you criticized about what people were doing about Russia, those same people are doing about China. They poked the bear with Russia, and they're poking the bear with China. They will
Although I think that poking the bear with China was an appropriate response to a period where we were facilitating the rise of China and Chinese power, not the rise of China's economy, but the rise of Chinese economy in the hopes that the country would become more democratic, and that just wasn't happening. And I think there needed to be a reassessment or restarting of relations with the Chinese, and that I think is appropriate. What I don't think is appropriate or helpful is simply poking and not actually.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
I agree with you entirely there. When I talk about poking the bear, I don't mean it I agree with you entirely. I mean the entire conversation. It's exactly what you were talking about, how the narrative that is so created by the press fosters within people seeing a country as an adversary who we must not see as an adversary, who we must see as a competitor and ultimately a collaborator. When you look at things like nuclear capacity, when you look at things like AI, China and the United States are going to have to be collaborators. This is the only way humanity will survive this century, is if we have a complete shift in paradigm when it comes to foreign relations.
I mean, I'm a believer in peace through strength, so I agree with that, and I do think that you have some of these other areas where we need to be able to collaborate because the risk is extremely high. So, Marianne, I know that your time is limited here. Before we go, one more question about your time on the campaign trail. Your time on the campaign trail. I'm curious to know what message of yours have you found that is resonating most strongly with people, and what have been like your main takeaways from your conversations with the American people?
In the 1970s, the average American worker could afford a house and could afford a car, could afford a yearly vacation. One salary could support a family of four, and one parent could stay home with the kids if they wanted to, and they could afford to send their kids to college. Over the last few decades, there's been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90%. So that today, the average American worker lives with a level of constant and chronic economic struggle. 1/3 of people working in America live on less than $15 an hour. Half of them cannot find a place to live. 1 in 4 live with medical debt. Tens of millions crushed by student loan debt. Half of our seniors living on less than $25,000 a year. What most speaks to people is how hard it is. The fact that over 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and that we need a fundamental economic reform. How the system as it is, that level of economic injustice and priority given to a few at the expense of the many has completely, as Louis Brandeis said, you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy, you cannot have both. So what resonates with people is the sense of the rigging of the American economy and what that does to democracy itself, how that has turned us into an oligarchy, how we are ruled by corporate and billionaire masters, and that we need fundamental economic reform through such things as universal health care. People understand that they have that in every other advanced democracy. People understand, Republicans as well as Democrats, a majority want universal health care, tuition-free college and tech school, which they have in every other advanced democracy. People, when they hear about subsidized childcare, paid family leave, affordable housing, guaranteed living wage, this is what resonates with people, because people's lives are falling apart. People see the homeless, the addicts, the addiction rate, the suicide rate, the crushing of people's lives, the mental health crisis. The mental health crisis is a spawn of all this. It's a result of all this. The despair that people live with, particularly economic despair. That's not only why I'm running, but it's also why the message that resonates with people the most.
So when is the New Hampshire primary? That's the first primary of the Democratic race. When is that?
January 23rd.
How are you polling so far? What are the latest numbers there?
Well, I'm not polling well in the January 23rd so far. I'm polling well nationally in terms of rising up.
Well, you're second. You're behind Joe. You're second behind Joe, aren't you?
Well, nationally I am, but I'm
Nationally.
not in New Hampshire. My opponent has huge personal wealth that he has said that he will use, and now he's all over television in New Hampshire, and it's certainly having an effect. So I certainly need people who want to sustain the race to go to Marianne2024.com so that the issue of money and politics is so abhorrent to me. It's not just the undue influence of corporate lobbyists and the money influencing the donor class and how it influences our legislators. It's even more than that. It's how expensive it is even to play the game. The hundreds of thousands of dollars that it costs to get into the on the ballots, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, the tens of thousands it costs to get voter files, the hundreds of thousands, even millions that people spend on television advertising. So you begin to see that the system is completely designed to make sure that only those who either have a lot of money or have access to those with a lot of money can even play the game. It's deeply disturbing because it's antithetical to democracy itself.
So you've done a lot of other interviews. I listened to a number of them before we spoke today. I want to recommend two other ones that I found very useful for people that are interested in learning more about you. One is with Michael Steele, which was much more policy focused. And the other one was with Gabby Reese, which was more focused on some of the other stuff that we spoke about, matters of the heart and um, personal issues, I guess. I mean, we spoke a bit about politics, but I thought it was a very good one. So I recommend those two for everyone if they're interested in learning more about you. Again, you give us out your campaign website again one more time.
Marianne2024.com.
Great. Marianne, thank you. This was really wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you very much. All my best.